Welcome to the sixth and final one of the presentations for the Atlantis course. This one will take you through some of the extra and new functionality at a fairly high level, but we'll try to start a discussion that will continue during the actual live session. So the evolution of Atlantis is that it started just with the food web and the ecosystem, and then eventually added some simple fisheries. From there, through time, we added the management loop and a detailed look at management strategy evaluation and what it takes to be sustainable fisheries. And on top of that, we then built the climate impact, socioecology, and increasingly other industries so that we can look at sustainable blue economy instead of just sustainable fisheries. And so that starts to get a sense of how the model's grown over the last 2 decades. As we go, though, we tend to backfill some of those other sections as well. So the new functionality is not just about whole new sectors of the blue economy. It can be about things to do with ecosystems as well. And a key one of those added recently was the multi-year migration. So the standard set of migrations is what you see at the top of there, where an animal leaves and returns in a fixed pattern on an annual basis. However, if you set flag multi-year MIGs in your run parameter file to be 1, it expects that there's going to be more complicated migration, such as what you might see in some of the salmon, whether at sea for a long period of time, multiple years, they come in, go up the river to reproduce. New babies come into the system and leave fairly quickly for the multi-year time outside the model. It can be really complicated with different years of entry, different stocks doing different things, multiple aging outside the model, recruitment or spawning outside the model. It can get quite complex, and the code has been difficult to get bug-free, but I believe it is now working well, and you can represent these really complicated life histories. Once the animal's outside the model area, you can choose to have just a standard or simple option for when it returns, where you do all of its incremental growth and mortality as a single step on return, or you can, by using both the external populations option and the flag external pop growth option, you can set it so it does a full-on population dynamics model on a daily basis while it's outside the model. That's so that you can replicate some of the nuances of population dynamics rather than a simple sort of hammer approach of the standard option. It's got incremental growth and incremental mortality. So potentially into the future, you can also have climate effects and other connections out there. Or you could even couple it dynamically to another model, whether that was another Atlantis model or another population model. So that coupling option isn't there yet, but it could be easily slotted in via this external population representation. So altogether, that allows us to allow for some unusual life histories, as do a few other options that we've included in the model now, like having multiple spawning events per year, which allows for sub-year cohort length, and that's primarily done for squid and prawns. We also allow for irregular reproduction. I wouldn't say that's functioning perfectly yet, but in theory it works to allow for really oddball animals like the Australian sea lion, where every different basically colony, call that area, reproduces at a different time and on an 18-month cycle rather than a more regular annual or multi-year cycle. That makes it quite an interesting and painful animal to reproduce. There's also some things to think about when you're creating these really unusual life histories, though. And the places where the code can get a bit mixed up or things can look like it's a bug, and we're very happy to try and fix these, is we spend a lot of time trying to deal with situations where the migration is coinciding with spawning or recruitment, as things that come out of the model and come in or leave the model right around the same time. That can make calendaring those events and making sure they all happen smoothly quite difficult. This can be complicated by reproduction or aging outside the model area. Like I said, I think we've got that nailed down now, but it has historically been an issue because it's quite complicated to make sure everything ages and returns into the right array when you've got really complicated life history characteristics with extended periods, either in gestation or recruitment, and then environmental influences on returns and location of return being linked to adults and all those kind of things. The other place that the model has historically struggled to do well, but most ecosystem models do, is around really highly productive species like prawns and cephalopods. Nailing their biology without going to fully age-structured models is quite difficult, and we're still working our way through updating the invertebrate reproduction code with the Icelanders to make sure that's working correctly. At the present moment, I have to say it's probably not working exactly spot on, but hopefully by the end of next week it will be. And then the other place you get into issues with exceptionally long-lived, like multi-century species. They can slowly build up unexpectedly. And that happens a lot with really large predators also that have a little predation inside the model. And I think that's because we're missing some density-dependent behaviour. So while we haven't put explicit behaviour in there yet for everybody to use, we are playing around with an agent-based model representation, so you can better capture some of those really big predators and their transient dynamics as they move through the system. A place that we've put a lot of effort into over the last 5 years is the representation of corals, where we represent the host polyps and their explicit processes of consumption, growth and mortality. And then we did try modelling the zooxanthellae explicitly, but it didn't work very well. So what we've ended up doing is tracking the proportion of the total coral biomass that's made up of zooxanthellae, so that we can track the bleaching events more easily. That bleaching can be driven by thermal events or salinity, so the major causes of bleaching, whether it's hot water, cold water, or really fresh water. That way you can have a direct link between things like degree heating weeks, which we track in the model, and the degree of bleaching. So those kind of relationships are starting to be better formed, sadly, because there's a lot more bleaching around. But thanks to data sets being collected by places like James Cook University, we are starting to be able to draw those relationships more confidently. And we can certainly start to track how the host ejects the zooxanthellae and then how it gets back. And we're even allowing for some of the inoculation effects where the acclimation happens with the zooxanthellae as it comes back in. We don't just consider bleaching, we also consider the growth effects of calcification and smothering. So each of these terms has a bit more detail to it, but the calcification basically looks at the current calcification rate possible given the water column properties and the biomass of the reef, and compares that to the like a threshold calcification rate. So that's the way that aragonite saturation and the resulting pH in the water can affect the growth of the corals, is by effectively scaling growth based on the calcification rate. Then there's also a multiplier based on the degree of smothering, which is a simple log distribution, log curve based on the levels of sediments in the water, particularly in the bottom layer that's contacting the corals, inside this very simple equation for smothering. We also include competition for space, where you've got the growth scaled based on the species competing with it, such as Phytobenthos, or species have a habitat preference less than 0, so they're being competitive. And the facilitative species, which are turf and habitats where there's a habitat link of greater than 0, so that they can grow on the top and stuff. Down the bottom here isn't actually something from Atlantis, it's from a PhD student, well, she's well and truly finished a PhD and a postdoc now, I think, where she built an individual based model looking at how reef formation occurs. But it's pretty good at showing you the competition and facilitation that can happen, and that's in an abstract sense what's happening within this kind of representation inside Atlantis, so you can get that much more complicated reef structure represented in aggregate. The other thing we include is bioerosion. That's where another living, potentially competing species like a sponge can dig in and undermine the coral's internal skeleton and affect the biomass. And then the last part is rigosity, which we just use a simple chain-like calculation to represent the three-dimensional structure that the reef habitat contains. And it's basically that dictates habitat provision, and it can be slowly degraded with time once the coral's dead, and additional coral growth can complexify that, particularly given the parameterization for different kinds of species. So you do need to parameterize and split apart brain corals and massive corals from branching corals and platform corals when you do that, but that's a fairly straightforward approach. You can lump them all together with a generic kind of coral, but it is better if you can break the different ones apart, not only because they have different rigosity differences, but because they age differently. So you can have a full age structured model of the corals, which is important for getting their recovery correct. The sponges, thanks to Albi, we also have sponges in some degree of detail in there as well. They do share a bunch of the code with corals, particularly the autotrophic, or the basically the light-driven corals, so to speak. You can have predatory corals or heterotrophic corals that are more just filter feeders. You can represent both. They have a different competition hierarchy to corals, so you can explain that explicitly, and it affects that competition facilitation representation. You can mark some as being explicitly bioeroding, so they dynamically interact with the rest of the reef. And potentially one of the biggest differences with corals is the potential for the breakdown rate of their rigosity contribution post-death. Whereas corals can continue to contribute for quite extended periods of time after the host animal dies, the skeleton retains some three-dimensional structure. Sponges disappear very, very quickly, like almost overnight. A really enormous barrel sponge like this can disappear. So that's one of the major differences. Going from the tropics to the Antarctic, one of the other things that we've put a lot of time into getting the initial structure in for is ice. This is used to some degree in the Arctic models and is just beginning to be used in the Antarctic models. It probably needs still a bit of work because ice is different in different parts of the world, which is not something I ever thought about before playing with ice. Up in the Arctic, a lot of the primary producers hang off the bottom of Arctic ice. And you tend to get like brine channels and things up into the ice. Whereas in Antarctica, it's a different kind of slush that happens. You have different classes of ice, and the microfauna actually lives within the ice structure itself, and the brine channels are super important in that case. You've got different classes of ice. So that difference is really important to capture in the different models of the different poles because it influences how animals interact with ice. Basically, the ice is tracked as a proportional area, considering the type and thickness of the ice and whether it has any ice-dwelling microfauna or whether it hangs off the bottom. Then the different species can be marked as ice users, and they can be dependent on ice for that as a habitat, or it can dictate where they move. It will also influence their access to prey and influence their reproductive potential if they're ice dependent. So all of that's sketched there in theory, but people like Denise and others will have to play with that as they go through to make sure it's working well, but the concept's at least in play. One of the most recent additions to the code is contaminants. So it's been in there for a while as a very simple representation where you just kind of add additional linear mortality during an event, but this now has far more elaboration. We define the list of contaminants and the units of the contaminants in the run parameter file. You can add them to the initial conditions file, so you can have quite a range of contaminants. For instance, the models we're looking at have 3 or 4 different kinds of hydrocarbon types. We've also played with heavy metals like arsenic and lead. So there's a range of different contaminants you can look at, potentially even pesticides. We have discussed plastics, but no one's done it in detail as yet. Once you've done that kind of definition, you can either just see how the standing stock evolves through time, or you can actually have additional releases, such as from point sources or plumes from spills. Now, once that it's in the water, you have a few different options. The simplest model just uses scalars of mortality, growth and recruitment, like I mentioned, which responds to direct forcing of the model around those things. But the more detailed one we've put a lot of effort into has quite detailed direct effects on growth, mortality and movement, and it has quite a long list of effects parameters to go with that, because you have to have the effects and the mortality. You have to have LD 50, LD 100. So what's the level where 50% of the population dies at exposure, the 100%? When do you start to see chronic effects that last long term? What's the shape of that, whether it's linear, sigmoid, piecewise uptake, and then whether it's different shapes of effect to reshape growth and mortality. So all of that is in itself quite a complicated contaminant by contaminant addition, but it has been important for looking at things like the implications of hydrocarbon spills and the implications of having an oil and gas industry in an area such as the Salish Sea. The other part to it, though, which is often much less well covered in the literature, is around contaminant interactions. And that's where the different contaminants can either act independently of each other or they can actually amplify. Very rarely do contaminants cancel each other out, but it is possible for the presence of one contaminant to amplify the effect of another contaminant. But you might still want to break down what's driving that mortality. So this is an example of the mathematics required to figure that out. You've got the natural mortality happening up this axis, then you've got the influence of the first contaminant here and the second contaminant there. So the overall mortality vector is then the combination of all three. If with an interaction term, that could be even and bigger. So then it gives you the proportion to be going forward with, so that you can have a look at the effects of single versus multiple impacts, which is really important for when you've got massively compound properties like some of the bitumens and stuff that are being moved about in Canada. So it's also in the model isn't just about the uptake and biological concentration up the food chain and traces of that, but also the breakdown of the materials themselves, what's their decay rates, what their physical dispersion through time. The dispersion we do by working with hydrodynamic models and putting the spill into the model, moving that spill with particle tracking, and then just reading the footprint of the spill back into Atlantis. So at the present moment, you can do simple dispersal in Atlantis compounded with the breakdown, but it's usually better to use a footprint from a dedicated particle tracking model. Along with the spills, you've got the other uses that come with traffic. So you can represent ship traffic and the noise that goes with it, which you can link to activity level. So the more transits and the larger the vessels, the bigger the noise, the greater the chance for strike. Most of the potential damage at the present moment is a simple rate by the level of exposure, but you can have secondary activities like avoidance of noise and light. So when the animals move, they can try to avoid those areas. There's also a vessel strike, so you can have a chance of being hit based on overlap, and then you've got a chance of whether that's a mortality event or just a damage event that affects your growth or your movement or something. For really shallow areas or really big ships, you can also look at benthic scour, where the movement of a ship influences the benthic life at the bottom, and particularly scour rates on things like seagrass and macroalgae. And you can also have the explicit dredging of channels. That's its own kind of vessel that dredges through, and there can be a subsequent plume if there's an at-release at sea. You don't have to have a plume, though, if it's something where they have to put the dredge spoil on land. Now, those dredging events can then influence the chance of collision, which is also influenced by the level of shipping traffic, which can then allow for dynamic spill footprints. In that particular case, you can rely on Atlantis's dispersal equation, or you can have preloaded a range of different spill configurations based on different tidal combinations, and it can just look up from that list. So there are a range of options through that, and it'll become more elaborate over probably the next 3 to 4 months, as a few of the people on this call have to work with it a bit more. One of the other areas we've spent a lot of time thinking about is acclimation and evolution and biodiversity and how you represent those. So I've done this a few times, more often for plankton groups than for vertebrates, but you can do it for vertebrates as well, where they update their distribution or their capacity for maximal growth based on getting used to a set of environmental conditions. So particularly used under climate change for foraging, density-dependent geographic distributions. And what happens is basically as the property state shifts, the parameter state can slowly shift to match as well. It basically follows this kind of representation. To get the rates of shift, we usually have to do that from laboratory or physiologically observed rates, which can be a bit hard to get hold of. A bit like contaminants, where it's often hard to get values for anything but larvae. It's hard to get update rates for adults, but it is beginning to be possible, or you can look through the geological record as a starting point. Then that gets us into evolution and biodiversity turnover. Given that many of the groups in the model are functional group, you're not really evolving a single species. You're kind of looking at species turnover within a functional group, but mathematically they're fairly identical. And the idea is that you have a distribution, instead of one set of parameters, you have a distribution of parameters for things like growth rates, reproductive rates, feeding rates, movement rates, all those kinds of things. And then the individuals who survive get to reproduce, and then they pass on their parameter values with a little bit of variation potentially, which means that the midpoint of the distribution shifts through time. So for example, here is the Gaussian start. As they get exposed to quite a lot of predation pressure, just say a new predator's moved in with climate change, then you can see that there's a shift in the resulting distribution. And that's how you get the parameters to evolve through time. You can see some strikingly different implications in the projections. So this is the relative biomass where you've got no acclimation on the case where you've got acclimation in the biomasses. And you can see that with no acclimation, you get quite a lot of squids, jellies, weedy, a very fast turnover system, much, much higher in a whole bunch of these fast things. But with acclimation, the system can cope more effectively. So the impacts of climate change in evolution are maybe not as big as you would initially think. And there are tipping points in the system, I'd have to say, for this Australian system. We kind of just run out of Australia, and so there's no capacity to continue to acclimate under severe climate change. But it is likely that just giving very simple fixed parameter estimates may be misleading as we go further and further into the future under climate change. The need for the representation of evolution, it also links back to some other options in Atlantis around having dynamic conditions. So the base example in Atlantis assumes a fixed ratio for healthy fish between the reserve biomass and the structural biomass, and that helps dictate reproduction. But you can turn on explicit respiration rather than, instead of having very low efficiency rates in the model, you turn on explicit respiration and have the cost of respiration in there around assimilation and costs of eating, costs of movement, all that kind of stuff. And then that still affects growth and reproduction just like it did, but you've got an explicit respiration term in there. If you have evolution, you want to allow for this to evolve too. So it may be that they can counter some of the impacts on growth and reproduction by becoming better and more efficient here. So Asta Ordenice allowed for that in her evolution model, so that is an option in there now and can influence the capacity to reproduce. For anyone who wants a bit of a rapid thinking about what's involved when you have a physiological model, this is a pretty good breakdown. DEB models are another example, so just think of this as a very simplified physiological model. Another thing that we've got in there in a very simple way are invading species, or it was originally invading species 20 years ago. It's more range extending species in the elaborations we've put in the last 5 or so years. It's not been used a lot. I've used it a little bit. the guys up in Norway use it a bit, but basically you allow for species to shift either within a domain due to environmental preferences, that just happens as a part of movement, or to completely enter the system as a new group. At the present moment, that simple representation sort of drip feeds some new arrivals into one box, and they disperse from there, driven by their environmental preferences and where they can find food. But there is the potential to make that more elaborate as people come to understand these range extending species more effectively, and it's something we'd really like to explore in the future. Another thing that we've looked at and we'd like to explore further is how to bring in land use and land-based industries and how they interact with the marine side of the world. So most Atlantis' models are only in the marine part, in these blue squares. But in a small number of Atlantis models, particularly the ones that I've been playing with, we do have the capacity to add land boxes and activities on the land. These can be things like agriculture, human population, settlements, a whole bunch of other human industries. You could basically define them the same way you define the land and what kinds of land properties they have, whether they're inundated flats that are tidally exposed, whether you get land reclamation or sea level rise in some of these shallower areas onto the flats, or whether they're areas that will always remain land. Then you've got a few different industries that are possible there. So it does make the system much more complicated when you've got to validate all of these other uses of the model, but it does expand it into a full blue economy. So most Atlantis models would consider this part of the world and maybe a little bit of the energy on the edge or the fisheries, but you can actually explore this upper part as well. So that's includes agriculture, the ports part, the heavy industry, a very simple air quality measure on land or coastal aquaculture. This can occur in pretty much any Atlantis model now, but you do have the capacity to have it in more detail. You can look at some of the influences of tourism and the human demographic model. So there's a bit of detail there. It's quite difficult to use, I'd have to say, even by my standards, in that you're trying to juggle an awful lot. But it is a possibility for those really places on the coastal margin where a lot of those things interact into the marine system. It's done in a fairly simple representation. So this is an example for Gladstone Harbour, which is the main place it's been used so far. You have simple dynamic representations for some of the key factors. For other things, you've just got the economic flow through represented, and some, while we have the potential for things like forests, we haven't actually really used them as yet. But as you can see, simple dynamic model are available for pretty much all those industries. What we mean by simple dynamic is that there's effectively a couple of lines of equations on what's the level of production given economic demand or the human local population, what outputs that has in form of industrial production and the economic turnaround, because it then flows through wages and the demographics model, but also the footprint that has back into the ecological world, which is perhaps the strongest link. It's typically done through simple response functions at present, but there obviously would be the potential to make that more elaborate for any one of those sectors should they prove of particular interest, and that's already happened with the shipping, where we now have the noise, the light, potential for dredging, collisions and that kind of stuff. As to what's next, I guess there'll be a bit more of an attention on those human dynamics as we play with them more in the context of the blue economy. Potentially biosecurity, I can see some advantage to having that inside Atlantis. Then again, I can also see advantages to it sitting outside Atlantis, but that is an option where I think we're currently a little bit light. In general, I think parasitism and pathogens and parasites and things like that are generally fairly lightly done in all ecosystem models, so just out of curiosity I might play with that in the future. So the idea would be to elaborate in more detail things beyond fisheries, or to explore things beyond fisheries in more detail as they start to interact more with the ocean things. There's also direct biodiversity influences. At the present moment, we've pretty much focused on what's known as alpha diversity, the kind of groups that are there. But you've also got beta and gamma diversity, which is diversity over bigger scales where there's more variation between which species are doing which role or functional diversity in different locations. And as Atlantis grows, or has the potential to be applied on bigger scales, we'd need to think about that. I've always been a bit resistant to doing a global or even a national Atlantis. I think that would be quite complicated, but we might be able to learn lessons from those models into how to bring in the influences of that multi-scale biodiversity back to Atlantis. Also, I'd like to have in our conversation that we have in the question and answer session, I'd like to hear what would be of interest to any one of you into what to add into Atlantis. So as a summary of all that, Atlantis started as a model of the natural system, and it was pretty much just for me to play with, to understand how you put an ecological model together, what influences, how do ecosystems work. Through the course of the last 20 years, it's grown from that to include simple fisheries and then more detailed fisheries. And now, as my interest and indeed the use of the oceans has expanded quite rapidly, it's now pulling in other stresses and other considerations, but also looking at more nuance at how ecology responds to those pressures. So the trick is to know what to turn on when. You can't sort of take on everything every time, but it has the potential to be there to explore some of those interactions, and it'd be interesting to hear what other people think would be interesting processes or things to include. Thanks, and I hope you've enjoyed the course so far.